What is queer? According to Webster's, queer means strange, odd, eccentric, unconventional, weird. There is a Northern England expression that states there's naught so queer as folk, or there's nothing as strange as people. But what makes people strange? For there to be strange, there must be a normal, unspoken and outspoken rules dictating the right way to look, to think, to act, to be. So it stands to reason to affirm that in order to be labeled as queer, all a person has to do is to deviate from one or more of these rules. But who would want to do that? After all, we live in a society, and societies don't like deviations. Strangeness is inevitably rejected and ostracized. Being queer means being an outsider, and being an outsider means being lonely, apart from the group and never a part of it. So what could one possibly gain from being queer? Well, as it turns out, a lot. You see, a curious thing happens when you're looking at the world from the outside. You're able to see it more clearly, and when you find yourself looking out at a world that was not designed for you, you start thinking of ways to transform it, change it, and even to create your own.
Let's go for a ride.
It is my honor, my deep honor, and my delight to present the 2017 Outfest Los Angeles Achievement Award to Mr. Bryan Fuller.
Bryan Fuller is a TV writer and producer responsible for some of the most original, brilliant, creative shows you'll ever see. There's a reason his fans have dubbed the collection of all the shows he's created as the FULLERVERSE. No one can make a Bryan Fuller show except for Bryan Fuller. Believe me, they've tried. Bryan Fuller also happens to be an openly gay man who's been out for pretty much his entire career. And with every project of his comes an almost unparalleled commitment to queer the mainstream and fight for representation. If you can tell yet, I have a lot of respect and admiration for this guy, and I'm a huge fan of his work and activism, both of which provide a very informative timeline of how queer representation in television has evolved since 2003. I spent a lot of time this year giving the film and television industry shit for their reluctancy/refusal to add LGBTQ representation in their products, but today I want to highlight the work of one of my favorite queer creators, one who's willing to go up against an entire system to, paraphrasing writer Anthony Oliveira, push the line as hard as he can in hopes that whoever comes after them can push it a little farther. So grab a piece of pie, pour a glass of red wine, hold on to your lucky coin, ignore all the talking animal memorabilia, and set the warp factor to 10 as we dive faster than a deorbiting toilet seat into the FULLERVERSE. In 2003, Bryan Fuller set out to create his first television series, Dead Like Me, a dark comedy following Georgia George Lass, an 18-year-old crushed to death by a toilet seat from a deorbiting space station.
Aw, shit.
Upon which she becomes a Grim Reaper, tasked with releasing the souls from people who are about to suffer a violent, otherwise painful death. Identity and death are two of Bryan Fuller's most recurring themes, and George's character deals with both of them from the get-go. We learned that even before her untimely demise, George already felt a little dead, having lost her drive and passion for life and just living day to day going through the motions, keeping everyone from getting too close by arming herself with apathy and sarcasm, which, same.
I certainly wouldn't have gotten as far as I have.
As far as that, I mean, it's not like this is a corner office with a view.
While at first glance that sounds a lot like a simple case of the adulthoods, the little touches Fuller adds make the character perfect for a queer reading. There's a parallel to be made to George's questioning of her own identity, her self-isolation from the world at large, and how queer people often face a similar experience upon figuring themselves out. Isolation can serve as a coping mechanism.
What happened to you, Georgia? You used to have friends. You used to be so smart. It's like you just gave up.
This comparison gets even stronger after George dies and is forced to live a double life. Turns out Reapers still need to eat, sleep, and do all the other stuff humans need to do when they're alive. This show is not subtle about its thesis of 9-to-5 office work resembling purgatory. So now that George is undead but still needs to function in the world, she adopts a new name and presents herself with a different physical appearance to the living, both so she can get a day job to pay her bills and so she can spy on and even communicate with her family. What queer person can't relate to George having to create a different persona to keep her true self hidden even from the people she was closest to? As the story goes on, she connects with her fellow undead colleagues, and they become a surrogate family to her, although I don't quite think the term chosen family totally applies here because none of them, including George, had any agency in their current situation. If yours was the soul unfortunate enough to have filled the previous Reaper's quota, you're now stuck with their job. There's also a moment in the pilot that really caught my attention. George's expressed disillusionment with God, an entity that is neither confirmed nor denied in the show.
When I was little, my mom told me Santa Claus didn't exist. Even though she didn't say so specifically, I just sort of assumed God didn't either. Otherwise, I'd probably be praying right now.
Remember this, we'll come back to it later. So Fuller doesn't talk about Dead Like Me that often, and there's a really shitty reason behind this. Working with MGM was hell for him, and he went so far as to call his time working on the show as the worst experience of his life. He was constantly butting heads with executives over creative differences and having to deal with stuff like being told he couldn't possibly know what an attractive woman was in account of him being gay. So he left the series about 5 episodes in. Which brings me to the scene in the pilot when George notices an unusually long hug between her father and one of his male students during her funeral.
Is a friendly hug between two men supposed to last that long?
That was a setup for a future storyline in which George would find out her father was gay, a revelation which would give her a new appreciation for her life, as she realizes that if her father had lived as his true self, he would not have married her mother and George would never have been born. However, once Fuller left, that storyline was promptly nixed by the show's new heterosexual showrunners, and the setup was left hanging with no payoff. Fuller, meanwhile, would move on to create and run a new show for a different studio, one which would allow him more freedom to write queer storylines, just not quite to the level that he wanted yet. All of Bryan Fuller's shows have gained a cult following during and after they were done, and this one is no exception, but I think it's the least known of the bunch. Probably because it only ran for one 13-episode season back in 2004, and from what I can tell it doesn't pop up on streaming services at all. I don't think it's even gotten an HD release. So allow me to introduce you to Wonderfalls, the best weird show you've never heard of. In this one we have Jade Tyler, who I can only describe as Eleanor Shellstrop.
I'm done fighting. From now on, I'm face bitch.
I came here to be nice. I knocked on 71 doors looking for your sorry ass just to be nice.
Hi. I think maybe I wasn't getting my point across back there. Here. I think it soiled itself. Who are you talking to? I don't help people.
Hey! I think I'm supposed to help you.
Anyway, Jade hears voices. Most specifically, she hears inanimate objects with animal faces, aka the Muses, speaking to her, sending her cryptic messages urging her to interfere in other people's lives.
See a penny? Pick it up.
Give it back to her.
Save the lovebirds.
Have a pancake. Let him go! Lick the light switch.
Fuller and co-creator Todd Holland, also a gay man, came up with the idea for the series as a modernized take on Joan of Arc, and early episodes were constructed to leave space for ambiguity as to whether the Muses are really talking to Jay or if it's all in her head. But as the show goes on, it becomes really clear that there's no way Jay could possibly predict the outcome of most of the events she sets in motion without some external influence that knew what he was doing. So by the end of the show, that's not even a little bit in question. The Muses are talking to her.
If I do this, will you shut up?
Given the premise, I don't think I need to elaborate on what makes Jay queer, but for good measure, like George, Jay is also smart but quite cynical and apathetic, having built all of the walls to keep people from getting too close. She's also trying to figure her life out, something which she's only able to do once her unique ability manifests. While she considers herself a screw-up and outright denies having any good qualities whatsoever, it's very clear through the course of the show that that's not true.
Hey, no one's more surprised than me on that.
Like, the Muses won't shut up unless she does what they tell her to, sure, but she could very much just throw them all in the trash and ignore them. She just opts not to, even if she herself isn't aware that that's what she's doing.
Thank you. You just saved my sobriety.
I didn't mean to. Hey, take that thank you back.
She's secretly kind, vulnerable, strong, and most importantly, willing to help others. She reveals that through her actions. So when we finally learn why she was chosen as the Muse's messenger, the reason behind it not only makes perfect sense to me, but honestly, I think it's the only satisfactory answer possible.
Tell me why you talk to me.
Because you listen.
Now let's shift focus to Jay's older sister Sharon.
You better stop. Ow!
Help!
In the first episode, we and Jay learn Sharon is secretly gay and she gets a love interest of her own named Beth, the bisexual ex-wife of Wonderfalls. That's the name of the store Jay works at, by the way, UPS delivery man. Having an out lesbian main character on primetime television in 2004 would be enough reason for me to stand. But as it turns out, Sharon is also the best character in the show behind Jay.
Stupid cow.
Selfish bitch.
Her simple existence already shows Fuller had more freedom to do queer stuff in comparison to his time on Dead Like Me. But unfortunately, Sharon's sexuality was not allowed to be fully explored. Yes, partially due to the show being so short-lived, but there were network stipulations prohibiting Fuller from depicting same-sex intimacy on screen. Sharon and Beth weren't even allowed to kiss, although a sex scene that was part of a future storyline in which Sharon would get pregnant from Beth having slept with her husband Bryan to sleeping with her, which by the way is the only time one of Fuller's ideas made me go, yeah, maybe don't, was filmed and briefly included in one of the DVD extras. Nonetheless, while Fuller did his best to work around Fox's bullshit no girl kissing or boning on screen rule, you can tell he wasn't allowed to do everything he wanted, and it's probably why we don't see Beth that often through the course of the show. However, network mandates aside, Fuller and Holland did include some interesting queer stuff here, with the show touching on biphobia by depicting Sharon's insecurity over Beth's bisexuality.
Oh, Jane, look at that. Look at the time. It's time for you to start dating peanut-allergic men again.
Plus some really funny comedic scenes of Sharon hiding her sexuality from the rest of her family, especially her mother.
I wouldn't miss it for the world.
Drive away. Drive away, drive away.
Sharon, glad I caught you.
Not a lesbian either, but you can't expect her to get every detail exactly perfect.
It doesn't say that.
Well, it was implied.
There's also the stuff that the writers were able to slip under the radar, and I am so glad they did because it makes for some of my favorite jokes from the show.
Blonde one's queer. Look at her. Fingernails are a dead giveaway. Cut all nice and short.
What I'm trying to say is please watch Wonderfalls. I need someone I can talk to about it. Yeah, I'm just gonna let Bryan introduce this one.
Pushing Daisies is the gayest thing I've ever done. Not just a little gay, it was such a deep-set, stubborn gay stain, it could never be scrubbed out. You can't scrub out that gay or het wash it.
In case, due to some terrible life decision of yours, you are not familiar with the show, let me first say that, in my opinion, this is Bryan Fuller's masterpiece. And by that I mean not just the best show he's created, but possibly the best show ever made.
More?
The facts were these. Pushing Daisies followed Ned, the pie maker, who possesses the gift of bringing people back to life by touching them. One touch brings life, the other permanent death. And if he doesn't take away the life he's resurrected within 1 minute, someone else in proximity dies in their place. The idea for Pushing Daisies came to Fuller back when he was working on Dead Like Me. There was a planned season 2 story arc where George would find out someone was bringing the soul she was reaping back to life, leading her to the pie maker, who will go on to star in his own spin-off. Fuller himself has acknowledged that although Pushing Daisies is the gayest show he's ever made, it was still a failure to represent since how none of the characters were non-heterosexual. However, he did not overplay the series' gayness. Everything about Pushing Daisies is profusely queer. The visuals are beautiful and unique, the way that the dialogue is smart yet playful, characters break into song, and there are allusions to old Hollywood musicals. The cast includes Ellen Greene, Susie Kurtz, Kristen Chenoweth, and guest stars such as Molly Shannon, Wilson Cruz, and Gina Torres. And all the costumes, all of the production design, all of the plot lines are unabashedly campy. For a show that is at its core about death, it radiates with life. Every element exuding queerness, and despite the unfortunate monopoly of heterosexuality, that includes the characters as well. Ned finds out very early in his life that
he wasn't like the other children.
And after inadvertently killing his mom after bringing her back to life, he starts off connecting to other people in fear of losing someone he loves again, preferring loneliness to possible intimacy. However, when his childhood sweetheart, Charlotte Chuck Charles, is murdered, he can't bring himself to let her die again, so he lets her live and the two of them move in together, quickly falling in love, but forever unable to touch. If you can't see the queer parallel over not being able to touch someone you love out of fear of losing them, I sincerely hope this is the first video of mine you're watching, otherwise I have failed you hard. I mean, Ned's powers basically make him a more fatal rogue. Chuck, of course, is also in the same can't touch the one she loves predicament. On top of that, her very publicized death means she can't return to the life she had before, taking care of her aunts, or even to let them know she's alive. Our other main characters include Emerson Codd, a private investigator who finds out Ned's secrets and teams up with him to solve murders, and Lily and Vivian, Joe's agoraphobic aunts, and Olive Snook. A former horse jockey, now waitress at Ned's restaurant, the Pie Hole, where she spends most of her days fighting for Ned, who pointedly tries to ignore her advances.
Can you get Digby's leash now?
Olive was initially going to be the show's actual queer character, by the way. Her original backstory being that she was a lesbian who got fired from working at a children's book publisher for changing all of the Jack and Jills to Jill and Jills before they went to print. I don't know for a second that had the show gone on, Hulu would have eventually included one or more queer storylines, but Pushing Daisies was unlucky in that its first season had really high viewership, but only made it to 9 episodes before the 2007 writer's strike happened. When the show eventually came back for season 2 10 months later, viewership declined, and although its average of about 5 million viewers per episode will get it going for much longer today, ABC went on to cancel it mid-season, leaving the story unfinished, which I believe was the exact moment when we entered this dark timeline we're all currently struggling to survive in. Like all of the evil in the world, this is all Disney's fault. Speaking of evil, so how does one follow up making the most heartwarming, full-of-life show ever put on film? With the bleakest, most morbid series one could imagine, of course. In 2012, Bryan Fuller was brought in by NBC to produce a series adaptation of Thomas Harris's Hannibal novels. Although a critical darling, Hannibal was never a rating smash, yet it's by far Fuller's most successful show, running for a whopping 3 seasons. Also, from the moment the pilot aired in 2013, it gains a rabid vocal fanbase, and I'm sure some of the Hannibals will take issue with me claiming Pushing Daisies and not Hannibal is Fuller's masterpiece, but let me clarify first and foremost that I do love this show. The main reason I love Pushing Daisies more is that A. Hannibal sometimes veers too much into the one character who's always one step ahead no matter how ludicrous and unbelievable it gets territory, which I hate and find boring. And B. This is the only Fuller project in which I think the women were done sort of dirty. In fact, if not for season 3, I would have said they were done dirty. And before you yell at me, keep in mind that I don't think Bryan Fuller will completely disagree with this.
We need female energy in all entertainment, I think. That's what's very exciting about season 3 is that I think we have a lot more female energy in season 3.
Again though, that does not mean I don't think this series is brilliant. It is an amazing achievement. It's visually interesting and beautiful as Pushing Daisies, but in the complete opposite way. While Pushing Daisies wouldn't shy away from body horror when it came to the Rick's murder victim, the overall tone of the show was uplifting and whimsical like a fairy tale. Hannibal, on the other hand, is nightmare fuel. A fairy tale only if we're talking about the original versions, yet the food, the violence, and the crime scenes are all presented as works of art, being both undeniably beautiful yet repulsively grotesque at the same time. Also, the show has the best acting I have ever seen in one production.
What's happening to me?
Will. Will you forgive me? Come on, man. Let's go.
How the hell has every actor in this series not been given all the awards? I've not read any of Thomas Harris's novels, and I've only watched Silence of the Lambs out of the movies. However, there are 2 big changes in this adaptation I was aware of even before I started watching it. 1. It takes place in modern times, and 2. There are no Brian Coxes or Sir Anthony Hopkins here. No. In this version, Hannibal is a hot cannibal who fucks. There's a new psychotic zaddy in town, and he will smash your guts before eating them. Okay, our protagonist is actually Will Graham, a special FBI criminal profiler whose wisely never specified mental disorder catches the attention of Jack Crawford, head of behavioral sciences, who brings him in to consult and aid in the hunt for serial killers. Will's condition makes him feel high levels of empathy, which he uses to get into the minds of murderers and recreate their crimes. Will is another Fuller character whose nature alienates him from everyone else. His very unique way of seeing from the world consequently making him, you guessed it, extremely lonely. Add to that his backstory of being moved around all the time as a kid, never settling in one place, always being the new kid in school, all of which explain his strong affinity for stray dogs, since in many ways, Will is a stray himself. Then there's Hannibal, who, as a serial killer psychopathic cannibal, also has a very similar way of seeing the world, hiding his true nature behind what his psychiatrist Dr. Vigilio de Marie calls his person suits, thus making him as lonely and isolated as Will is. That's why when the two meet, Hannibal is instantly drawn to Will and his unique capacity of understanding Hannibal's way of thinking. Will can see the world through Hannibal's eyes, and Hannibal can see himself in Will, recognizing Will's potential for being just like him, which is why he starts using his knowledge of psychology to get inside Will's mind and manipulate him to try and corrupt his sanity and make him a killer. However, Hannibal is not the only one who feels this connection. Will is hopelessly drawn to Hannibal before and after he figures out he's a cannibalistic killer. Will's fully aware of his own internal darkness, and he also believes that Hannibal is the only person who understands him, going so far as to admit that
I've never known myself as well as I know myself when I'm with him.
So, okay, we need to talk about this. Come on, you knew it was coming.
Did you just smell me?
Fuller said what he was most interested in exploring in the series was the nature of male friendships, and, of course, the Will-Hannibal relationship is the force that drives the show. So let me make a very important point here before anything else. Will and Hannibal? Not queerbaiting. Once again, for the people in the back, queer readings of homoerotic subtexts are valid, but they are not queerbaiting. Fuller himself has been very careful to never cross into this territory, and has stated multiple times throughout the course of the show that he was aware of and agreed there was homoeroticism in this dynamic, but he never dangled it in front of the audience with an implied promise of Will and Hannibal possibly having a hot makeout session if we continued to watch the show. In fact, Fuller outright said that Will was written to be heterosexual, and the text itself backed him up. However, the truth is, any deep analysis of male homosocial relationships eventually dives into homoeroticism simply by virtue of all the rules that are broken when two men get too emotionally close. So it's no surprise that the show focusing on the development of two men's fascination, obsession, and connection to each other would quickly become homoeroticism in the series. However, unlike most films and shows whose creative minds realize after it's out in the world that they've accidentally made a gay, and then hastily try to undo it in subsequent outings because no homo, Fuller and the writers leaned in the homoeroticism, and the more the show went on, the more the subtext developed into actual text, so much so that by the end of season 3, we had the scene that sent countless shippers into a frenzy.
Is Hannibal in love with me?
Could he daily feel a stab of hunger for you and find nourishment at the very sight of you? Yes.
It's as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in ecstasy and were suddenly silenced post-orgasm. All jokes aside, this was an extremely logical progression for the story to take. The show had been developing toward this for 3 years. Everything from the hurt in Hannibal's eyes when he learns Will's betrayed him, the many times Hannibal hurt Will physically, emotionally, and psychologically, always in hopes of pushing him over the edge so he would join him or as a direct response to Will playing him again, the moments when he gives himself up so Will will always know where to find him, how hard he works to try and isolate Will from everyone else so the only tie he has is with Hannibal. I mean, remember back in season 1 when Hannibal and Will formed an emotional bond with Abigail and Hannibal outright said he saw them as her fathers?
We are her fathers now.
Then they had up until 5 son in season 2, and because Bryan Fuller clearly loves to have a good time, he ended the season by having Hannibal literally penetrate Will. Although personally, my favorite moment of the whole seduction ritual is when Will sets his plan to expose Hannibal in motion by showing up at his office looking like a snack, telling him he wants to resume their sessions together. Would you fuck me? By the way, Hannibal alone by himself has always been queer-coded too. Something of a low-key fuck. Vain, dignified, obsessed with proper manners, highly intelligent and educated, a lover of the arts, fine cuisine, European of course, and a huge opera queen. Which does fall under the trope of coding queerness as a trait of villainy. And when we add that to the way the show ends, with Will giving in to his murderous instincts and teaming up with Hannibal to kill the Red Dragon in what I can only call a homicidal spit roast, and then Will lovingly racing Hannibal before pulling them both off a cliff to their deaths, The show does end up sending the old unfortunate message of how queerness will always end in tragedy.
We belong dead.
However, that last part was an accident. It was not supposed to be how the series ended. Fuller had at least 3 more seasons planned, and the lack of any visual confirmation of Will and Hannibal's deaths was written in so the story could continue in season 4. But alas, NBC cancelled the show before its time. Which I suppose is fitting since it was so ahead of its time. Frankly, I believe Hannibal would have been a lot more successful if it had been made today in a post-Killing Eve world. But given how explicit and, well, gay the show was, it's an achievement in itself how it ran for 3 years on broadcast television. Also an achievement, Fuller finally got the lesbian sex scene he wanted since Wonderfalls. I think once Hannibal was cancelled, Bryan Fuller decided he wanted to do something that would allow him to get all the ingredients he spent his career perfecting and mix them all together in one thing. Thus was born his adaptation of Neil Gaiman's American Gods novel.
Do you believe? Do you believe? What do you believe, Shadow?
In many ways, this was the perfect Bryan Fuller show, visually striking, witty, deep, and completely bonkers. It had all of the trademark Fuller elements: death, loneliness, fantasy, camp, and of course, queerness.
I don't know. I really like anal sex.
It was the perfect combination of pushing Daisies and Hannibal, up to having imagery lifted straight from the shows. Had things gone differently behind the scenes and Fuller and co-creator Michael Green being allowed to complete their vision, I have a feeling this would have taken the title of being Fuller's masterpiece. But alas, dark timeline. We can't have nice things unless they're given only to be taken away. So American Gods follows Shadow Moon, Ricky Whittle in his most whole-throbbing mode. A non-believer handpicked by Mr. Wednesday, aka Odin, to serve as his bodyguard as they travel the country gathering an army to fight in the impending war between the old gods and the new gods. But who I really want to focus on is Salim. Salim is an Omani Muslim salesman living an unfulfilling life in New York. One night he meets a taxi driver who turns out to be a demigod, the Jinn, with whom he hits it off, and what happens next is the most beautiful, on its moments a gay representation that has ever aired on television.
14 years after being powerless to keep the first gay character I created from turning straight, I got to be part of telling Salim's story. Salim is a gay Muslim immigrant. He comes from a part of the world that tosses homosexuals from rooftops because of God. His story is about a demigod giving a man permission to be himself and to enjoy sex and allow himself to be made love to. Telling Salim's story isn't the gayest thing I've ever done on TV, it's the most human.
Unfortunately, due to the explicit nature of the scene, I can't show much of it here. But believe me when I tell you that it was a groundbreaking achievement of gay representation, not just because of what was shown on screen.
Yes, there were boners and anal penetration and flaming ejaculation, but it wasn't pornographic. It was art.
But because of all the meaning behind it. Remember that Death Like Me scene? George's disenchantment with God resonates with me, and I'm sure a lot of queer people would and do feel this way too. In a world where religion and God are often used to justify LGBTQ persecution and even murder, telling us we're sinners and unwelcome to and by God, lest we try to change our very nature, it's easy for queer people to eventually lose their faith in God and in the very idea of religion itself. So for a story to depict a deity granting a gay man permission to embrace his sexuality, enjoy sex, and live as his true self is not just incredibly subversive, but extremely important and powerful. I had never seen a TV show framing gay sex as divine and as beautiful as American Gods did, and if I could tattoo moving pictures on my skin, I would put this on my forehead. This was all in Gaiman's novel, but it was Fuller who, being aware of its importance, made sure it was brought to life in the best, most thoughtful, and real way possible, going so far as to have a reshot once he saw the first cut and noticed the mechanics of how gay sex works were all wrong. To quote, "Unless he has a 12-inch candy cane cock and can fuck around corners, his dick's not getting in him. So you guys need to go back and figure out where holes are." Bryan Fuller, ladies and genders, the hero we need and deserve. American Gods was a great show, and I'd already fallen in love with it before we were introduced to Salem and the Jinn. But the fact we're likely never gonna see how Fuller would have continued with his story is what breaks my heart the most. You see, the show is still going, but shortly after the first season ended, came the news that Fuller and Green had left the show, allegedly over not reaching an agreement with Starz over the budgets for the second season. even though they had already completed about half of the season's scripts. Just like Dead Like Me 14 years prior, when Fuller left, he took all of the series' queer sensibility with him, and I couldn't force myself to watch beyond the second season's first episode because it was simply not the same. You can't make a Bryan Fuller show without Bryan Fuller.
Fuck those assholes.
Yeah, that's the spirit. Fuck those assholes.
But let's look at our timeline. We went from Fuller being unable to stop the whitewashing of a character he had conceived as gay in 2003, to being allowed a gay character but no explicit depictions of same-sex intimacy in 2004, to covertly making the gayest show ever made with no gay characters in 2007, to queering a story not originally written that way in 2013, to a highly stylized lesbian sex scene in broadcast television in the same projects in 2015, and an explicit and artful gay sex scene with nudity and accuracy in a major, much anticipated adaptation of a beloved modern literary classic in 2017 with no resistance from the network or studio whatsoever. This is progress, and all this within one man's body of work. Bryan Fuller called Pushing Daisies the gayest show he's ever made, and I'm in full agreement there. However, I go further in saying that I think all of his shows are queer. No matter how often he was unable to add explicit representation, or the times he was forced to abandon his own creation. If they came from his imagination, they were inherently queer because Bryan Fuller is queer. And being queer means seeing the world in a way other people can't see it. That vision is what makes each of his shows so special and unique, something studios have consistently failed to recognize and or admit. I have not yet seen the whole of Star Trek Discovery, sorry that I'm not actually going to analyze this one. But while I hope the quality remains high past the point of Fuller's departure, I'm under no illusions that it will feel the same. I'm also extremely bummed that he's no longer involved with the Vampire Chronicles series they're making because there's nothing in the world I watch more than a Vampire Chronicles series run by Bryan Fuller. He made Hannibal gay as fuck. Can you imagine what he would do when the source material is already right there with him? Dark timeline. But not the darkest. Representation is a talking point that will not and should not go away. But why were we repeatedly promised by big corporations that maybe next time they'll perhaps be bothered to include it, or outright told to shut up and settle for scraps? We can never forget how there are many queer creators out there who refuse to give up on telling our stories as they deserve to be told. Look at all that one man called Bryan has accomplished. No matter how many times we're knocked down, we'll keep picking ourselves up, ready to continue the fight. Because see, in the end, change won't come from Star Wars or Marvel or Frozen 2. It will come from where it always comes from. Us. We are the strange ones. The odd. The eccentric. The unconventional. The weird. The queer. And what a blessing that is. Because within us comes the power to dare and change the world.
Now that's a queer achievement. Thank you very much.